Kyara could feel the vibrations of her ship even in her sleep. She was jolted awake by the blaring emergency sirens. The red lights on the console screens were flashing. Warning, severe damage, mandatory landing required, echoed the ship's automated system. Rubbing her eyes to fully wake up, Kyara moved to the control seat. When she looked at the screens, she saw that her ship had sustained heavy damage and was being rapidly pulled towards the planet Vorlath. "Stay calm, Kyara," she murmured to herself. Her hands were sweaty and her heart was racing. She needed to make quick decisions. She was losing control of her ship. Her eyes scanned the indicators on the console swiftly, pressing the right buttons to activate the landing mode. But the ship unexpectedly swerved to one side. As it entered Vorlath's atmosphere, the screens displayed dark cliffs and toxic storms. Kyara clung tightly to her seat, trying to regain control of the ship. "Come on! Come on!" she shouted, her hands shaking as she gripped the controls. The ship shook violently, and for a moment she thought she had lost control. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, and seeing the cliff and slope ahead, her heart pounded. With all her strength, she tried to stabilize the ship, and with a final effort, she managed to soften the landing. The ship crashed onto Vorlath's surface with a loud noise and skidded to a halt. Kyara clung to her seat from the impact, her vision blurring as she felt dizzy. When she came to, the alarm sounds were still echoing inside the ship. For a few minutes, she struggled to breathe, then took a deep breath and slowly got up from her seat. She felt cuts and bruises all over her body. Kyara slowly made her way to the ship's medical section to check her injuries. Every step was painful, but her survival instinct kept her going. She tried to treat her wounds with medical equipment, but realized her resources were limited. As she looked around, she saw that her ship was severely damaged and understood she would have to face the harsh conditions of the outside world. She gazed at the exterior of Vorlath. Among the steep, black cliffs and dust clouds, the menacing howl of toxic sandstorms could be heard. She knew this planet was dangerous, but now she felt it in all its reality. Kyara could anticipate how challenging the environmental conditions would be. She had to survive alone on this alien planet. Before opening the ship's exterior door, she decided to repair everything she could. Maybe she could get the communication system working again and send out a distress signal. But before she could reach that stage, she had to pull herself together and meet her basic survival needs. Returning to the ship, she gathered materials that could be used to create a temporary shelter. As she looked around, the weight of loneliness and despair momentarily overwhelmed her. However, her survival instinct kicked in again. To survive on this harsh planet, she had to be strong and act wisely. As night fell, Kyara retreated to her temporary shelter. Before closing her eyes, she looked at the distant stars for a moment, harboring a faint hope that help would come one day. But for now, she had no choice but to think about ways to survive. A tough night awaited her, and she continuously formulated escape plans in her mind. As she drifted off to sleep, Kyara was determined to do whatever it took to survive in Vorlath's dangerous world. In the darkness and uncertainty, her struggle for survival was just beginning. Chapter 2: The First Night. Kyara woke up shivering inside her makeshift shelter. The cold air seeped through the walls of her broken ship. The howling of toxic sandstorms outside made the night even more terrifying. Kyara checked her wounds. Deep cuts and bruises reminded her of the severity of the landing. The limited medical supplies made each treatment attempt more challenging. In the dim light of her shelter, Kyara found a small bottle of disinfectant and a few bandages to clean her wounds. Tears streamed down her face as she wrapped her injuries in pain. Every movement was a struggle, but she had to be strong to survive. "I won't give up this easily," she murmured to herself, trying to muster courage. The sound of the sandstorms outside distracted Kyara. In the midst of the storms, there was a sense of a force that could destroy her shelter at any moment. "This planet is fighting against me," she thought. However, she had to find a way to survive in these harsh conditions. After completing her medical treatment, Kyara decided to use the intact parts of her ship to create a more durable shelter. Every piece could slightly increase her chances of survival. She gathered metal plates and various materials to reinforce her shelter. Despite her trembling hands, she carefully planned and executed each step. Once her shelter was strengthened, Kyara knew she needed to find food and water to survive. Fortunately, her ship's water purification system was still operational, which was a great stroke of luck. However, food supplies were limited, and she had no idea what she might find on the planet's surface. She realized that going outside without knowing what dangers lay beyond the sandstorms was risky. In the darkness of the night, Kyara worked on repairing her ship's communication system. To send a distress signal, she needed to realign the antenna and stabilize the power source. She made fine adjustments with her hands, carefully placing each cable. The flashing lights on the screen were like a glimmer of hope. However, Vorlath's magnetic field and unknown forces made transmitting signals difficult. As Kyara checked if the communication system was working, she took a deep breath. "What will I do if this fails?" she thought. However, her survival instinct forced her not to give up. With one last hope, she pressed the signal transmission button. Despair settled heavily in Kyara's mind. In loneliness and helplessness, tears rolled down her cheeks. Yet, her strong will and desire to survive lifted her back up. To survive on this planet, she had to be strong and think smartly. While spending the night in her shelter, Kyara's mind was constantly occupied with escape plans. She had to evaluate every moment and seize every opportunity. As she closed her eyes, she looked at the distant stars once more. Maybe one day someone would hear her distress call. But for now, she had no choice but to think about ways to survive. As the cold of the night penetrated Kyara's body, her mind was filled with determination and resolve. As she drifted off to sleep, she was determined to do whatever it took to survive in Vorlath's dangerous world. In the darkness and uncertainty, Kyara's struggle for survival continued. Chapter 3: The Call for Help. As the darkness of the night gradually dissipated, Kyara opened her weary eyes on the cold metal floor of her ship. Outside, the sandstorms were still raging fiercely. Vorlath's harsh and hostile atmosphere reminded her of its presence every moment. Gathering herself, she stood up and checked her wounds. The bandages were not as tight as they had been the night before, but at least the bleeding had stopped. Now, she had to do more to survive. First, she turned her attention to the ship's communication system again. The system had failed during her attempts the previous night, but Kyara was not going to give up. Vorlath's magnetic field and mysterious forces were hindering the transmission of signals, so she suspected there might be a deeper issue with the system. She examined the console for a few minutes and rearranged the cables. She realized she needed to go outside to place the antenna in a higher position. Aware of the dangers outside, Kyara prepared herself. She put on a thick protective suit and tightly secured her helmet to shield herself from the toxic storms. Clinging tightly to the ship, she stepped outside. The powerful winds of the sandstorms pushed her back as she located the metal pole needed to elevate the antenna. Despite her trembling hands, she carefully placed the pole and raised the antenna. Working in the midst of the storm was challenging. Sand struck her face and eyes. However, Kyara continued her task with determination. When the antenna was in the correct position, she felt a momentary relief. She quickly returned to the ship and shut the door, shielding herself from the storm's noise. The silence inside felt like a sanctuary compared to the chaos outside. She turned back to the ship's communication console. This time she made some fine adjustments to boost the antenna's signal strength. Planning each move carefully, she prepared to send the signal. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the button. The flashing lights on the screen were like a beacon of hope. "Please, work this time," she murmured. The signal was sent, but once again, no response came. Kyara sat silently for a while, feeling the weight of despair. However, her strong will and desire to survive lifted her back up. She had to keep sending the distress call. Maybe the signal was taking time to transmit, or perhaps someone would eventually hear it. To conserve energy, Kyara put the system in low-power mode and decided to keep the communication console running continuously. Then, she turned to check her food and water supplies in other parts of the ship. Food supplies were limited, but at least the water purification system was working, which slightly increased her chances of survival. She gathered the broken parts inside the ship and tried to repair whatever she could. Each small success gave her a bit more hope. However, she knew the overall condition of her ship was still critical, and she needed to make more efforts to protect herself from external dangers. The next step was to develop a strategy to deal with the external dangers. The sandstorms and toxic atmosphere made it impossible to stay outside for long periods. However, short exploration trips could help her understand the surroundings better and maybe find useful resources. Waiting inside without knowing what was out there was not a solution either. For a moment, Kyara looked at the cliffs and storms outside. Vorlath seemed to be fighting against her. However, her strong will and desire to survive encouraged her to battle these harsh conditions. "I will conquer this planet," she thought. "I will survive no matter what." Later in the day, Kyara planned a short exploration trip. She put on her protective suit again and took the necessary equipment. As she stepped outside, the force of the storms and the grandeur of the cliffs reminded her once again of the planet's dangers. However, these dangers motivated her more than they frightened her. With each step, she became more determined. During her exploration, she hoped to find some resources near her ship. Maybe she could find materials necessary for survival, or at least get to know her surroundings better. As she moved through the sandstorms, her eyes constantly scanned the environment. She remained alert, taking each step carefully. After a few hours of arduous walking, Kyara found a small cave entrance. The inside of the cave seemed like an ideal place to take shelter from the storms outside. As she ventured deeper into the cave, she found an area where she could stay for a while and protect herself from external dangers. Inside the cave, after resting for a bit, she planned her way back. When she returned to her ship, she documented her findings and experiences, starting to form a strategy for survival. The distress call was still unanswered, but Kyara's hopes were not extinguished. She was determined to do whatever it took to survive on this planet. In the dark planet of Vorlath, Kyara's struggle for survival continued. Each day brought new dangers and a new glimmer of hope. Kyara had to be strong and act wisely to survive in this perilous world. Despite the harsh conditions, her strong will and desire to survive continued to motivate her. Chapter 4: The Arrival of Orin. In the depths of space, Orin immediately sprang into action upon catching a faint distress signal from Vorlath. Reviewing his galactic maps, he knew Vorlath to be an uncharted and perilous planet. However, as an explorer with a strong sense of ethics, he could not ignore the call for help. He quickly made preparations and set off in his robust exploration vessel, Vanguard. As Orin approached Vorlath, he could clearly see the planet's toxic sandstorms and steep cliffs through his ship's scanners. He knew the landing would be challenging, but he was determined to find Kyara, taking all necessary risks. The ship began to shake as it entered Vorlath's atmosphere. Orin focused intensely on the landing, maintaining control of his ship while searching for a safe landing spot. After successfully landing on Vorlath, Orin stepped out of his ship, his protective suit necessary to shield him from the toxic atmosphere. He was met with a landscape of black cliffs and menacing sandstorms. Following Kyara's signal, his ship's scanners directed him toward a faint energy source. As Orin ventured further from his ship, he felt the dangers of Vorlath more acutely. The howling of the sandstorms intensified with each step, and the shadows of the black cliffs made progress difficult. Yet his courage and altruism urged him forward, rather than deter him. Eventually, he spotted the wreckage of Kyara's ship. It was heavily damaged, and Orin could surmise that Kyara had faced significant challenges to survive. As he approached the wreckage, he noticed a thin stream of smoke, an indication that Kyara might still be alive. He quickly approached the wreckage and began searching for Kyara. When Kyara heard sounds from outside, she became anxious. Peering out from her half-destroyed ship door, she saw a figure in a protective suit. At first, she thought it was a threat and withdrew. However, seeing the medical equipment in the figure's hands and their benevolent approach, she felt relieved. Upon seeing Kyara, Orin took a deep breath. "Hello, my name is Orin. I'm here to rescue you," he called out. Kyara carefully observed Orin's gestures and expressions to overcome the language barrier. It didn't take long for her to realize that Orin had come with sincere and helpful intentions. Orin approached Kyara to check her injuries. Using the medical equipment he brought, he effectively treated Kyara's wounds. With Orin's help, Kyara felt relieved, and for a moment, her solitude ended. On this alien planet, she was no longer alone. After the treatment, the two sat inside Kyara's ship and began to plan. As Orin listened to Kyara's accounts of the dangers of Vorlath and her struggles to survive, he thought of ways to help. "We could try to repair your ship," Orin said, "but staying on this planet longer is dangerous. I'm here to help, and together we'll find a way out." Impressed by Orin's bravery and determination, Kyara agreed to work together to repair the ship. Their first step was to build a stronger shelter to protect against the outside dangers. Orin used materials from his ship to reinforce the shelter, and they both became better prepared for Vorlath's harsh conditions. After reinforcing the shelter, Kyara and Orin began identifying parts of the ship that needed repair. With Orin's technical knowledge and Kyara's instincts, they started repairing critical systems of the ship. Each small success gave them a little more hope, though dangers were still present, and they remained vigilant. At the end of the day, both were tired but hopeful. As Kyara searched for words to express her gratitude, Orin understood her gestures and expressions. "We'll make it," Orin said. "We'll do whatever it takes to survive on this planet." As night fell, Kyara and Orin sat in their shelter, planning their next steps. Kyara's days of loneliness and despair were behind her. She now had a friend by her side to help combat the perils of Vorlath. In the dark and unknown world of Vorlath, Kyara's struggle for survival had gained a new beacon of hope with Orin's arrival.